Well, good afternoon and welcome to Signs of Destiny 2004. As your host, I'm Dr. Chet Snow, and this afternoon we are going to learn about crop circles in America. And we're really privileged to have Jeff Wilson with us. Jeff has a general science master's degree from Eastern Michigan University. He has also served as a very special weather watcher, and he now lives in Ohio. And I think that in part, although I may be corrected on this, that his move to Ohio this year is at least in part stimulated by the fact that we have had some of the most extraordinary and interesting groups of crop circles occurring in southeastern Ohio in the last 2 or 3 years here. And so I'm sure he's going to talk about that as well as other crop circles right here in the United States of America. So, without further ado, I want to bring on Jeff Wilson, who is going to tell us all about crop circles. And one other thing, after, I think it's at 4 o'clock, or is it 4:30?
I think it's directly after that.
It's right after his talk, I believe. You can go upstairs if you want to meet with him. He will be having a meeting of the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association that is a free meeting up in the workshop room, those that are interested in that, so you can follow Jeff. Okay, Jeff Wilson.
Thanks, Chet. I really appreciate you inviting me down here, and I want to thank Ted St. Rain, who is doing the video, because he recommended me to Chet, I think, last year after I gave another talk at another location. Well, I want to start out by referencing some of the things that some of the other speakers that have talked so far this weekend and made mention of. For instance, Ms. Connor last night in her talk urged us to understand our heritage. Where did we come from to get to this point here? And John Major Jenkins, one of the things that he made mention of was that it's our task to discern the truth from the fiction. And today, Francine Blake repeatedly mentioned that one person cannot cope with understanding all of what's going on in the crop circle world. And it's sort of a gift for all humanity, and we need to collectively come together to understand what's going on in crop circles. And I think that all three of those things are going to apply to what's been happening here in the United States. I've been going at this now here in the United States since 1996. That was the first crop circle I went to, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment or two. So I've been at this a while. I've been looking at crop circles, reading about them since about 1986 or 87, and reading the scientific literature that was being produced at the time, and then later on the books and when it exploded in the early 1990s. So I've been looking at this quite a while. So let me continue. Again, for everyone here, this may seem like a simple question that everybody should know, but what are crop circles? This is a picture of a crop circle that appeared in Bainbridge, Ohio, back in the year 2000. And it's just, this is one part of the formation, but this looks like a simple circle. While crop circles at their most basic level are swirled and flattened areas and patterns that are found primarily in agricultural fields. That is the most basic level, but as we've seen, that level, there are many, many more levels to it than just this, but when at its primary, this is what we're looking at. Well, where are crop circles found here in the United States? This is a map that I just finished completing about 2 or 3 weeks ago, in which I took all of the records that I had accumulated over the last 15 or so years of looking at crop circles and plotted them out on the map here in the United States. I have records that date back on this map to 1880 here in the United States, and there are about 380 so crop circle reports here in the United States mapped on this map. I also have been cooperating with Paul Anderson of the ICCRA network up in Canada, and we're slowly putting together the Canadian map, so you'll see a series of crop circles here in southern Ontario. That's where we started. So eventually we'll have the entire continent map of where all the crop circles have been located. And one of the things that may be apparent to you, but let me answer one of the questions that I always get is, where do crop circles come down? Well, they come down where the crops are. And that's pretty evident on this map. Where the green is where most of the crop circles are. Where there's deserts and mountains, there's not a lot of crop circles. So I always get asked, well, how come there aren't crop circles in my state? Well, that's part of the reason why, right? So this is sort of a breakout of the reports by state and the numbers that I have reported for each state. So this is rather small, and I'm going to get to the top 10 states here in another slide. But if you want to try and pick out your state here to see how many crop circles have appeared there, you're more than welcome to go ahead. Ohio, of course, is number one, leads the category with 29 crop circles reported. And this is a breakout of just the top 10. Ohio, Iowa, California, Oregon, Missouri, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Kansas, New York, and Washington. Now, when I first looked at this, I thought, well, that's really interesting because there are kind of three regions that are represented here in the top 10. If you look at this, we have Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and you can include New York State because most of these crop circles appeared on the west side of the state, not on the eastern side of the state. And so all of those are kind of considered to be Great Lakes states around the upper Midwest. The second grouping is Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas. They're in the Central Plains. And then you have California, Oregon, and Washington on the West Coast. Those are where the majority of crop circles are clustering here in the United States. So when do crop circles appear? Again, this may seem like an obvious question, but to really understand it here in the United States, we have had reports from every month, at least one from every month, but the vast majority of them are in July and in August. Quite a number in June. We do have quite a number in May, but they continue on into October, and this is kind of interesting. September is kind of a decline from October, and I think there's a period there after some of the kinds of crops get harvested before the feed corn gets harvested, and that gives you the difference in the number. The feed corn gets harvested a little bit later. So what kind of crops do crop circles appear in? Here's the breakout in the United States. Wheat is number one with 36%. Grass, number two with 19%. Corn, 11%. We have 5% now in soybeans, which was quite rare until the last couple of years. Barley at 5%, oats 3%, and so on down the line. The other classification up here is either reports that I didn't have a specific crop that was named or that it was actually something other than what was listed up there. This is a slide I put together recently to try to explain the variety of crop circles that we see. This is I call the crop circle spectrum, because crop circles are not just the extraordinary geometric patterns that we've seen here in the United States or in England or elsewhere around the world, but there is sort of a continuum. You can have everything along this line, much like the full spectrum. So we have the complex formations. This is from Miamisburg, Ohio, this year in corn. This is Bainbridge, Ohio, in soybeans from last year. Those are extraordinarily complex geometrically, and I'll get to that in a little while. Then we have arrangements of circles, like you see here. This is from Minnesota this year. This is from Oregon several years ago. This is two simple circles. This is actually, there were two circles in this one. One is off the camera here, but this is in corn from Michigan, Hemlock, Michigan, from 2002, and this is from Shreveport, Louisiana, in grass, another single circle from last year. to what we call randomly down formations, what don't appear at at first glance to not have a specific geometry, either circles or geometric patterns at all, but that have all the hallmarks of all of the testing that we do on regular crop circles, the Planck anomalies, the electromagnetic effects, the radiation, so on and so on. They can look incredible, and we'll see a couple of more examples of these, that match everything that you can find in those except for the geometry. And this is a good example of it down here. This one here is from Wisconsin from 2003. This almost is like a thought bubble design on a curve, almost circles that almost happen. It's almost as if there's like an interference pattern that takes place that doesn't allow the geometry to form exactly. I kind of liken it to trying to tune in a radio station where you can hear the radio station, but it's just slightly out of tune or out of phase, and so you kind of get some interference there. Well, I think that's what's going on with some of these randomly down crop circles. And they can range anywhere from 100 to 1,000 feet for these and down to a foot on some of these small single circles. Well, how long have crop circles been reported here in the United States? Again, I've had reports dating back to actually 1849, but I don't have a specific location for the one in 1849. This is from 1880 onwards. And you can see there was quite a number reported in the 1960s. And actually, in the last 5 days, I've received probably 6 reports from the 1970s that are going to bump up this number right here. Not very many in the 1980s. I'm not sure why that's the case at this point, but by 1990, of course, we had the escalation, just like we saw the escalation in the number elsewhere around the world. There was quite a drop-off here in the United States back in 2001, only eight or so reports, but that really spiked then in 2003, the most reports we've ever had, and although that's come down this year to about 20 reports. So by decade, as we look at the breakout, from 1880 to 1949, only 7 reports. The 50s, there were 12 reports. In the 60s, 33. Again, 1970 to 79, that number is going to go up and probably come really close to the 60s. A drop-off in the 1980s, and then soaring in the 1990s. But look at the numbers so far here. In 4 years in the 2000s, we're already half of the number that we've seen in the 1990s. Well, let's do a little bit of historical underpinning, going back to understand where we came from in terms of crop circle investigating. Well, the first known crop circle investigator was a gentleman named Robert Plot, who was professor of chemistry at Oxford University in the late 1600s. And in 1680, Plot traveled from London to the southwest of England to look at what he had been hearing farmers report, namely swirled circles and patterns in the wheat fields in southern England. And he traveled there firsthand, and in his own words, he excavated 50 crop circle sites, or roughly thereabouts. And he noted the farmers' stories of additional reports on top of that. Francine Blake talked about this diagram. This is his diagram of trumpets blowing down, and these are the patterns that he found. Now, it's been widely misunderstood that crop circles, in terms of them having geometry, did not appear before 1990 or so. Well, that's clearly not the case if back in the 1600s, Robert Plot was noting squares and other patterns and flows. So the geometry has been around quite a long time. It just hasn't been as well recognizable, and certainly not to the sophistication that we've seen, say, in the past 8 or 10 years. But Plot was very much in the science realm, and although science was sort of on its early footings in the 1600s, he did his best at the time to be as thorough as possible in detailing what he saw. So he noted that there were simple circles, circles with squares, circle rings and spirals. He noted that animals tended to stay away from crop figures. he did his own historical research just before he died in 1696. He uncovered a report from August of 1590 in the Netherlands that described a single grass ring that had been, quote, trodden down by a whirlwind, or obviously kind of swirled down. He published his first work mentioning crop circles in a book from 1686 called The Natural History of Staffordshire, in which he hypothesized that crop circles were formed by what he called hollow thunderbolts. Or else, in his case, if it wasn't hollow thunderbolts, it must be either elves or dancing witches, deer or mosses. He wasn't really sure, but his best guess was that it was some kind of hollow thunderbolt, which is very interesting considering the sound or the electrical meanings behind that idea. Plott also did the very first soil sample testing. He took dirt from the center of crop circles, from the inside edge of the crop circles, and then from the field outside, and he compared the dirt. And he noted that there was soil dehydration and that there was, in many cases, a white sulfurous residue that was inside. So he was doing some of the early soil testing. He also noted that crop yields in the areas in which the crop circle boundary happened, in successive years, the yield increased by about 30%. Now, all of this was done in the late 1600s. All of that sort of had to be rediscovered in the 1980s and 1990s with work from people like Terence Meaden and W.C. Levengood and others, that they had to kind of recover all this ground that Plott understood all the way back then. Well, it's almost 100 years later before we see crop circles show up in the historical literature again. In 1790, there was a publication called Gentleman's Magazine, which was kind of like the Time magazine of its day. And they began running a series of letters by several different authors that were published under the title Hints Towards a Natural History of Fairy Rings. And that ran for about 3 years. And there was a running debate between different authors as to what is the origin of these so-called fairy rings. And they included many, many descriptions of what we would know today to be crop circles, although they called them fairy rings. There were several diagrams published, and this also began to be the first sort of division or split in terms of understanding what crop circles are and what they aren't. There was a school of thought that the fairy rings were what we know today as fairy rings, are these fungus rings that a ring of mushrooms or dark grass will appear, versus the flattened circles, swirled circles of grass or grain that was being described. And because this is before photography and before widespread distribution of information, they could not understand each other very much. One camp is saying, no, we know what this is, and the other camp is saying, no, you're not understanding. These are swirled down. They're not just these rings. And so they kind of argued back and forth for about 3 years, and then they sort of dropped it. They do reference a paper which has not been located yet, but that they reference a paper that was published by the Royal Society on crop circle origins. And in that paper, which is mentioned in Gentleman's Magazine, the hypothesis was that some particular effect of lightning was causing the flattening. So again, they're trying to understand, well, is this electrical in nature? Again, about another 100 years goes by before we see some other publication coming out. In July 21st, 1880, a new magazine, relatively new magazine, science magazine called Nature, was starting to be published by J. Norman Lockyer. And he published a letter to the editor by a scientist by the name of J. Rand Capron. He was a noted spectroscopist in the southern area of England, and he started to hear reports of these swirled, flattened circles, and he wrote into Nature magazine as an appeal to other people to come forward and report more of these so they could be studied. And in the ones that he looked at, he postulated that there were some storm effects associated with the appearance of these, heavy rainfall or cyclonic wind action that could be responsible for the flattening. He also did several diagrams of what he had written about and sent that along with his letter to Nature, but Nature declined to publish it. Back in the year 2000, Nature republished his article, but again, without the diagrams, which still exist in their archives, but they've been loath to publish it for some reason. Well, again, another 100 years goes by. We take you up to 1975, and here in the United States, a gentleman named Ted Phillips, who was researching UFOs, published a book called Physical Traces Associated with UFO Sightings. And in his book, he reported on hundreds of cases worldwide of what we today would know to be crop circles, swirled, flattened patches of grass and grain. And he also did his level best scientific work to try and understand this. He classified the types of what he called landing traces there were. He did distribution analysis, much like I just showed you, by state and country. He published photographs in his book. He did advanced soil analysis in at least 7 cases where he did spectroscopic analysis, scanning electron microscopic analysis, and seed germination tests. This is close to 20 years before W.C. Levengood did his seed germination tests. And so Ted Phillips was kind of an early pioneer, but because he was working in the UFO field and considered them to be solely UFO landing traces, this work didn't get widely disseminated whatsoever. But just a few short years later, about 1980 or so, Dr. George Terence Meaden, who was an atmospheric physicist in southern England, he was the editor of the Journal of Meteorology, started hearing reports of them in southern England where he lived, and this begins what we now today would know to be the modern study of crop circles. He spent about 10 years looking at crop circles in southern England, collected about 40 eyewitness cases. Very good book, the very first book published on crop circles, called The Circles Effect and Its Mysteries. Now, of course, Meaden's hypothesis, which was an electrified whirlwind or a plasma vortice was the natural cause of crop circles, doesn't quite explain the kinds of things that we see. But as any good scientist, as new information came into him, he modified his hypothesis. You test your hypothesis. If it doesn't match the test, you have to adapt. And that's exactly what he continued to do, but he got blasted in the media for this. And people just dismissed him as not understanding or being too limited. And he sort of became disillusioned with this along about 1990, 91, and kind of gave up the field. So he doesn't really look at crop circles very much anymore, which is kind of a shame. Well, the earliest USA report that I have is written by a gentleman named Henry Schoolcraft. Henry Schoolcraft wrote in 1847 a document for the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, a short segment that was entitled The Magic Circle in the Prairie. Schoolcraft was touring around the upper Midwest doing Indian ethnography work, and he was copying down stories and mythologies of all of the tribes that he could encounter. And one of his treaties, this Magic Circle in the Prairie, describes a Native American going into a flattened, swirled circle in the prairie grass. Obviously, there's no doubt about the description, what we know today as a crop circle, but he doesn't give a location, and there isn't a whole lot of additional detail. But that's the earliest historical reference I've been able to come across. Well, I got my start, as I mentioned, in 1996 here in the United States going into crop circles, although I had been reading about crop circles and kind of studying them for probably 8 years before that. And the first place I went to was a crop circle in Paulding, Ohio, which is in northwest Ohio. A single 90-foot diameter circle in wheat. The best thing that could have happened for the researchers was that the local sheriff put up this yellow police tape all the way around it and was treating it like a crime scene. This has only happened, I think, one other time. There was one in South Carolina the previous year that the local sheriff did the same thing. But this one I went to, I heard about it on the radio. It was close enough to me. I was living in Michigan at the time. I was teaching physics and astronomy at Eastern Michigan University, and I talked a chemistry friend of mine into going down there with me, and I borrowed a Geiger counter from the physics department, and we drove down there. We arrived, of course the security is there, but I asked the sheriff, I said, has anybody been here from any sort of educational institution or a crop circle organization or anything like that to do any studies on this? And he said, no, no one had yet. So I said, has anybody done any radiological examining or anything like that? He said, no. I said, well, I've got a Geiger counter. I'm from Eastern Michigan University. Do you mind if I go and check this out? And he said, by all means. So I talked my way past the police tape, and I started to walk from about right here towards the center of the circle with my Geiger counter on. And as I did that, as I started walking across the center, the amount of radiation that I was picking up continued to increase. And it increased till I got to about 8 feet from the center, then it dropped off a little bit. It was kind of like a donut, and when I got back to the center, it shot back up to about the same top level. Now, the radiation that I was picking up in here is not anything that's dangerous. It's not much more than what you would receive on a sunny day, but it's statistically significant, higher over what we measured out here in the rest of the field. You could actually cross the threshold and watch the radiation meter go up. So, of course, people with a board or a garden roller aren't going to be able to reproduce radiation. So this obviously, to me, wasn't somebody mechanically making this, and so that's where I got my real start here studying crop circles in the United States. About April of this year, I received this photo from a researcher in Columbus, Ohio by the name of Chris Steele. He was at Paulding, Ohio at the same time I was, unbeknownst to us. We did not meet at the time. We met several years later. But he took a photograph of me making my measurements with my Geiger counter. So I was really surprised to receive this here in April of this year. I didn't think anybody had ever taken a photo of me doing that, but there I am. Well, what I want to do is kind of flash forward from 96 to about 2003. Although there are a couple of hundred crop circles in the interim between that, I don't have time to go through them all. We did that at our ICCRA meeting earlier this year in April that we held in Ohio, and it took about 6 hours. We went through every one of them. So I'm not going to go, I don't have time to go through that, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights here, starting with one of the first crop circles that was reported in the year of 2003 down in Noble, Arkansas. This is a 10-circle fractal design. And you can see there are no tram lines in this field. These circles are quite isolated from any tracks. This was taken, the aerial photo was taken before anybody got out there. This line going across the field is a water pipe, which does actually cut through one of the circles. But when this news of this crop circle made it to the farmer and made it to the local media, the farmer was really incensed by this, was not happy at all to have this in his field, and so he harvested it, then he burned the field, then he tilled it, kind of making sure that no one was going to get out there and gather anything, and there weren't going to be people milling around in his field. That happened the day the story hit the news. So now, Nancy Talbot at BLT did contact some people down there in the region, and they did go out to the area where they believed the crop circle was and tried to do some soil samples, and she may talk about that. She reported that the concentration of magnetic soil in that area was about 9 times higher than what was found in the surrounding region. Well, I was also looking at the design of this crop circle, and I just want to take a minute to explore this. We looked at that fractal design. This is it right down here. You can see the line going across. Well, this design is not new. It has been seen previously in some variation or another. The first time it was seen was this formation, which was in New Zealand in 1998. That was first shown on an NBC TV special that was geared toward people hoaxing crop circles as the only explanation for crop circles appearing around the world. So a team of crop circle hoaxers were flown to New Zealand and spent about a week creating this design. And you can see the sort of Mandelbrot set in the center, but we have our 10-circle main fractal design, the same one that we see here, which is, I think, quite interesting. There was another formation that appeared in 1999 in Canada, up in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Saskatchewan. This is they only got a picture of it from the air after the field had been harvested, but you can still see it. It had one additional circle in one of the arms, but essentially it's the same exact formation, but with one additional circle. And then in 2001, near Bluebell Hill in Kent County, this same 10-circle fractal design, but with 3 standing centers in the main circle, appeared in 2001. The researchers that I talked to that made it there on the ground were convinced that that one was a hoax, although I really have no indication one way or the other. But this is a repeated design that we've seen before. In June of 2003, in Prince William County, Virginia, I received word of a gentleman who claimed to have witnessed a randomly down formation get put down. Now, I didn't receive this report until probably 6 months after it happened. So I got this probably around December of 2003. But Ben Keyes, the eyewitness, who is kind of an elderly gentleman in his 70s, I talked to him on the phone. He called me up and gave me the whole story. He was in his house on the 2nd story one night after returning from a ghost hunters meeting. He's an amateur ghost hunter. And he was listening to his dogs go wild in the basement. They were barking. He couldn't get them to stop and shut up. So he went downstairs, tried to calm them down, went back upstairs to his 2nd-story bedroom, and looked out the window that looks across the street to this wheat field. And he watched as what he called a tumbling, flashing ball of light came along, in from the distance and then stopped over the field. The ball of light then pulsed several blasts of a blue light into the field, and then sped off at high speed up into the sky. Now, there was some high clouds, and there was a little bit of a drizzle going on at the time, but the next morning he went outside and saw this big, huge patch of randomly down wheat there. Now, being an amateur ghost hunter, he had a tri-field electromagnetic meter, which measures electric field strength and magnetic field strength and so on. And he took that out to the field, and as soon as he got to the edge of the field and walked right into the edge of it, it pegged his meter, which is pretty unusual. Usually if we go into a crop circle, it may go halfway, 3/4, something like that. But that's pretty significant. He didn't get that outside the field, but he pegged his meter while he was inside. Well, he was kind of scared about that. I mean, that's a high electromagnetic field. If it pegs the meter, he doesn't know how farther it's going to go, so he figured he better wait. Called up a buddy of his in Virginia, MUFON, who then came out, and in the afternoon, they went back out to the field. They again pegged the meter, but the Virginia MUFON member convinced him that it's going to be okay, let's go out to the field anyways and check it out. While they were out there, they took a series of photographs of these spinning balls of light. Now, they report, as them eyewitnessing this in the field, that they weren't white balls of light. They were spinning chrome spheres. But when they took the photographs and they got them developed, they turned out to be these little white spinning balls of light. And they have a whole series of these. Well, they continued on through the whole day seeing these balls of light, went into the night, and then he captured a series of photographs of this ball of light kind of flying around in the field. So these are pretty stunning photographs, I think, and this sort of is an incredible case, an eyewitness case right here in the United States. Just a couple of days after this, the whole country sort of received word that there was a crop circle in the town of Rockville, California, which is in Solano County. This is the formation that everybody probably has seen, or is at least the famous picture. It was on a lot of the news broadcasts and in the newspapers and everything else. But what is less well publicized is that the same morning that this was discovered, this formation was also discovered about 2-3 fields away, about a half a mile away. Both formations came down on the same night, and although this one was extremely well visited by about 30,000 people in the first 10 days, and tracked it all up and really kind of destroyed it for the researchers to really get anything out of it. This one was not, and so this formation really did get some good research data from. This formation was authenticated using a process called the LNEAT, which measures elongated nodes, and I'll get to that in a little while. But we authenticated this formation, and we're going to look at some interesting things about this formation as well. There was a couple eyewitnesses that night that lived alongside one of the streets over here did see balls of light flying over this field prior to the formation being found. But it's kind of conflicting in terms of the eyewitnesses' testimony. One described a ball of light, basketball size, floating around, and the other one described a beam of light, or a pillar or column of light. And it may be that both of those occurrences happened, but 2 different witnesses reported that. Now, this formation was claimed to be a hoax by 4 teenagers who came forward and claimed this, that they said that they did it. And the local district attorney investigated it and found that their story didn't check out. We examined their story and found a number of inconsistencies in their story that they lied about and things like that. So we don't believe that that was the case, although it was widely publicized that this was a hoax. One of the researchers that worked on this with us is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jean-Noel Aubrin, who is a physicist and engineer. And he took the measurements of the circles themselves, and he applied Dr. Gerald Hawkins' methodology of examining the dimensions of crop circles to see if there were ratios there that would match diatonic ratios, and lo and behold, there were. Now, diatonic ratios are the things that correspond to the musical notes on the white keys on a piano keyboard. So the notes that he found associated with the circles here are C1 being the lowest C on the keyboard, C1, F1, A2, C2, G2, C3, and D4. And they originally played the results of this at a press conference they held to sort of announce their results that they had been working on. And so I'm going to play you here what those notes are real quick, if I can get here. Okay, so those are the notes and the diatonic ratios found encoded within the sizes of these circles here in Rockville, California. When I talk about randomly down formations, people get the idea that, well, it's just some random mess that's out there in the field. But here is an example of sort of regular kinds of patterns that we see in a randomly down formation. This doesn't seem to be too random, does it? There's some pretty regular geometry there, although when you look at it from an aerial photograph, there is no special design or geometric pattern to it. I found this in Washtenaw County, Michigan, just a few days after the Rockville, California formation came down. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to track down who owned this field. I drove past the field and checked all of the houses locally nearby so I could get permission to get into the field. And as I did so, as I was driving past the field, I noticed that there was a deer standing here staring at the flattened wheat. Now, this is in the middle of the day, about 1:30 in the afternoon. So I thought this was kind of cool. I'll take a picture of this. And then I went door to door looking for the person, and I found that the farmer actually lived about 4 miles away, and he was in another field harvesting stuff. So it took me a couple of hours before I could track him down, get the permission, and come back. And when I came back, 2 hours later, the deer was still there staring at the field. Now, this is kind of an example of animals not wanting to go into areas where crop circles go down when they first come down. And I parked my car along the side of the road. I got my equipment out. I walked up here, and that deer just would not move. And I've got another picture of it later where it finally decided to run away from me, and it ran the length of the field. It wouldn't cut across the field whatsoever. And then finally, behind this wheat back here, here's the back edge of the field, and there's soybeans back there. It then finally cut across the soybeans, but it wouldn't go into the wheat. I was given 1 hour by the farmer to go out there and do a survey. He wouldn't allow me to go out there any farther because he heard about what happened in Rockville, and he heard about the 30,000 people that showed up, and he did not want anybody out there because he didn't want that happening in his field. So while I was there, I did pick up electromagnetic anomalies. I did find blown nodes. But again, I only had 1 hour to spend my time out there. I will have to say, though, that this is one of the few formations that I also had a violently ill reaction to being in a crop circle. Many people report various physical effects. And in this formation, after that 1 hour, I was just totally sick. And it took me probably 3 or 4 hours to just kind of recover from that once I left the formation. But that's one of those kind of unusual cases. I did find one kind of 3-foot diameter circle embedded within the whole entire kind of randomly down area. Well, just a day later in Wisconsin, in between or located near two towns called Kokoski and Mayville, Wisconsin, there was another eyewitness case. And this one we heard about relatively quickly, and we traveled to Wisconsin to meet with Art Rantella right here. And this is Roger Sugden, who is the chief investigator for Indiana MUFON. And he and myself and Dr. Chuck Lietzow, who is here in the second row with the beard, traveled to Wisconsin, met with Art Rantella to hear his story about watching these crop circles come down. He gets up very early in the morning. He was a just retired truck driver who got up very early in the morning all the time, so sort of body clock gets him up early. He's sort of an avid weather watcher, so he tuned in to the weather that morning to see whether or not the local 4th of July parade was going to get washed out. And he heard that there were big storms that were coming by him, big weather front was coming. And so he decided he would go out to his workshop and sit there to watch the weather go by, because he kind of enjoys watching the fronts move past. And while he was there, about 20 minutes after he saw that on the news broadcast, the wind started to pick up, and it started to blow some bark off the tree right outside his workshop window. So that sort of directed his attention in that way. He then looked across the street, in which there's a house and a grove of trees, and they started to sway violently back and forth. And that directed his attention across the street down to the wheat field down the hill just below, and he watched 3 crop circles form. This crop circle, then this one, in 12 to 15 seconds. Swirl down, swirl down, swirl down. He did not see this pathway go down, but when they walked out there about 11 o'clock in the morning after the rain stopped, the pathway was there also. He had a great view. He was up on top of a hill looking right down on it, about maybe 1,000 feet from it. He saw no lightning, no whirlwinds, no UFOs, no lights, no nothing. No unusual sounds, just swirled down, 1, 2, 3, 12 seconds. So when we arrived, of course, we took down his statement. He's a great guy. And we started finding all kinds of interesting anomalies in this formation. We found the kinds of curlicue things that happen to the wheat, of which we're really not sure what process can create that at this point. We found blown nodes, what we call blown node collars, to be more accurate, in the formation. We found that there were concentrated magnetic particles in the formation. This is Roger Sugden, where he had touched his magnet to the soil and it clumped around the magnet. Then he went outside the formation and touched his magnet to the soil, and you can see the difference. There's quite a bit of difference there. And we did this statistically. We verified that the concentration of magnetic particles is different. Bert Janssen, I sent some of the dimensions to Bert and some photographs, and he found, looking at his geometry, that there was this underlying 8-fold hidden geometry that was involved in creating it. So these circles didn't go down at random. There was more geometry than what is apparent here. And then later on, we sent the information to D. Gregg, who is sitting here in the second row as well. He is a retired engineer, and he applied the diatonic ratio methodology of Gerald Hawkins to the formation, and he found different geometries, including finding an additional geometric theorem that Dr. Gerald Hawkins did not find. Hawkins found 5 theorems that apply to crop circles. Well, D. Gregg has found a 6th. And he also applied not only the same geometric methodology of Hawkins, but he also applied trigonometric means, and not just Euclidean means. And he's found some fascinating things. And I would encourage people to go to Crop Circle News to read his report, because there's a lot more to it than just what I can tell you right now. But just to briefly make people familiar with what Gerald Hawkins was looking at, Hawkins, who was the author of Stonehenge Decoded in 1965, determined that there were astronomical alignments encoded within Stonehenge, and he essentially began the field of what is now known as astroarchaeology, where sacred sites and different places, ancient sites, are found to have certain alignments like solstice points, equinox points, rising and setting points of the sun and the moon and things like that. Those were encoded here in Stonehenge. Well, in the 1990s, he started looking at crop circles, and he found that the dimensions of crop circles matched certain ratios. And those ratios, like 9/8, 5/4, 4/3, 3 seconds, and so on, also corresponded not only to the crop circles, but to the musical scales, and that's where the diatonic ratios come from. So those are the piano notes, C, D, E, F, and G, A, B, C, and those are the first octave ratios, second octave ratios, and so on. And so you can apply that methodology to understand those things, and then you can apply it to the musical scale, and you can hear those notes that we heard, and we're going to hear some more later. And here are the 5 geometric theorems that Hawkins had found. Well, that's not the whole story at Kokoski Mayville, because while we were there, our little team, the first day we collected a lot of information that we needed to collect. And we spent the night there, got up the next morning, went back out to the field. I took Roger Sugden to the airport to take aerial photographs. He took aerial photographs. I went to pick him up. And as we arrived on the way back, Chuck Lietzau was already in the field. And we saw this military helicopter come in and buzz us, literally just a couple of 100 feet off the ground. Now, these are as the helicopter was moving away. But I took a series of photographs that appear to show a ball of light also by the helicopter. Now, we've heard of this in England before, but this is the first time in the United States that we've seen military intervention here or interest whatsoever. And within about 40 minutes after the helicopter left, I happened to notice we had walked all the way to the back of the field to collect some soil samples, and we were walking all the way back. Roger and Chuck had taken the top of the hill, and I had taken the bottom of the hill, and walking back parallel along the field. And I noticed that up on the hill at Art Rantella's place, which is up here, I noticed that somebody was up there with binoculars watching us. Well, he got in his car after I spotted and alerted them, and he drove right past us, was in military uniform, copied down our license plates, drove down to the end of the road, turned back, and parked his car and walked straight into the crop circle. And here is Chuck along with the soldier in the crop circle. We spent about 20 minutes with him in the formation. He told us that he was part of a special crop circle investigative unit that was operating out of Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. We have not been able to confirm that through Freedom of Information Act requests. We've been pretty much stonewalled in every attempt. Although we have been able to identify the helicopter came from a National Guard base in Wisconsin that did fly over there. He did say that he was operating at the time out of a hangar in Milwaukee just temporarily, and that they had been based there for about 2 weeks looking at this crop circle. And we kind of walked him around and gave him the tour of all the things that we had found up to that point. I gave him my contact information, and we haven't had any official contact since. And we have yet to hear really from the military on this. Well, just a couple of days later, in California, in Vacaville, California, this enormous crop circle feature came down in corn. This is close to 800 feet in length. It's longer than a city block. These are houses here. And this happened within about a 4-hour window of time on a Sunday afternoon. There is an airport just off this picture on the other side of this field, a local private pilot airport, in which pilots were flying into and out of that airport that day. The one pilot reports flying over the field around noon, wasn't there, was coming back from his flight and flew over the field, and it was there. Now, what's more extraordinary than that, to narrow down this enormous formation to that small time window, is that inside the formation, Steve Moreno and company out there in California looked at this, was that about 60% of the plants inside the formation were gone. They were just not there. They could find remnants of pieces of the major part of the stalk down at the base, but the rest of the plant material was gone. Now, that's completely unexplainable to us. We have only seen this sort of shearing action in about 4 or 5 other crop circles. We reported this, and then we received a couple of reports, one from Ted Robertson in Indiana, and 3 other reports from Canada, from the Canadians, that they had also seen this in corn, where the stalks had been sheared off. And we're really not sure what can cause this process to happen. But I'd say sheared off, but that's really not a good term to use. It's more as if something had just separated the top half from the bottom half. There was no kind of shearing mechanical action done here. It just sort of disappeared, like the top half is gone. So that's kind of interesting. But of course, Steve Moreno, who had only been in the Rockville, California circle, that was his first crop circle, called us up and said, we probably need some help on this. We don't really know exactly what we're doing. So we organized quickly what we call an international televideo investigation, the very first one that people have ever attempted, where Steve took his laptop computer and his cell phone and a video camera out to the field, hooked his video camera into his laptop, hooked his cell phone into his laptop, and then as they walked through the formation, broadcast the video to myself and Chuck Lietzau in Michigan, Mike Bird in Toronto, and Paul Anderson up in Canada, broadcast it internationally so that we could see what they were seeing, the investigators were seeing, as it happened, as they first walked into the formation, and we guided Steve as best we could to help him in his investigation. So that was kind of fun. Pardon me? Oh, Steve came in from this area over here and walked into the top of this, and as he came in, he only got to about here because the rest of this was underwater. So they really couldn't make it any farther in the rest of the field. So this was pretty much as much as they could handle at the time. Did high energy affect the camera? No, it did not. Although they did have some battery problems. I guess they did go through a couple of different batteries, but I don't know. We were there for quite some time. So if you want a question, I got a number of slides left to go through. He said 30 minutes, so we'll keep going. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Howell, Michigan, but this crop circle was interesting, not just for the expulsion cavities and the expulsion fissures that were found, but we did find circles underneath the main lay. So as we lifted up the main lay, there were 4 circles swirled down underneath the main circle, which is kind of unusual. I got another report of crop circles in Wisconsin, so we drove back to Wisconsin. We did not find the ones that were reported. They turned out to be bogus reports. But on my way home, we were driving along this road here, and I looked over my shoulder, and I saw this circle right here. We drove over there, quickly got the farmer's permission, got into this formation, and of course it's quite large here in the town of Clyman, Wisconsin. This is the formation, obviously evocative of the early 1990s formations in England. We did authenticate this with the LNEAT process, and the day that we found this, the farmer, although he gave us his permission, he told his brother that we were going out there, and his brother convinced him to harvest the field immediately. So we were in the field doing our work as they started to harvest the field, and it was gone by the next day. Well, it wasn't too long after that we received word on the Locust Grove, Ohio formation from August of 2003, which was discovered and reported by Delcy Knockelman, who's here in the second row. This is a large geometric formation in soybeans, which at the time was really unusual. There were only 10 known reported soybean formations ever reported before this one. And this is in alignment along this axis with the ancient effigy earthwork serpent mound. And it appeared alongside Paint Creek, directly in between 2 geologic faults. There was heavy rain and power outages around the time of formation. So just to quickly give you a little picture on Serpent Mound here, here is the mound itself. The field that we're looking at is off in this direction, just outside of the frame. Encoded within this, much like Stonehenge, are astronomical alignments of the moon's setting points, the solar solstices, and other things. And it is unclear as to the date of this, although it may correspond to the constellation Draco, and it may also encode astronomical information that dates back around 10,000 years. So it's really unclear as to how to date this, although there has been carbon dating done near here that ascribes it to only about being 1,100 years old, but that nothing has been excavated from the mound itself. Well, every metered test that we did inside that formation came back statistically significant. Well, what does that mean? Well, we measured for radioactivity, electric field strength, magnetic field strength, radio and microwave emission, and a sum of the magnetic and electric. And we did plant comparison tests, and every one of those tests came back that what we measured in that formation was higher than what we measured outside the formation. So this is a chart of the radiation readings. All of the blue color readings are from the formation. All of the yellow colored readings are controls taken outside the formation. Here are the electromagnetic field readings. This is the magnetic from different points of the circle formation, and then these are the controls down here. All of the controls were less than all of the other readings inside, including the radio and microwave emission, which we had never previously measured anything in that frequency band before this formation. We'd never got radio microwave emission. We always used it sort of as like a benchmark to zero out our readings, and unusually we picked up readings in that part of the spectrum. Well, what happened to the plants? Well, sitting in there, we quickly realized that soybeans aren't measured in the same way that wheat plants are, because they don't have growth nodes. They're sort of a vine-like plant, but they do have these little soft, kind of spongy areas at the base of these stems that kind of shoot off the main stem, what they call the leaf base. This is a control plant, and this is what happened to those leaf bases inside the formation. They were quite affected, and you can see the necrosis there. This is a cross-section of that. This is a control one, and there are these little fibrous hairs on the outside of the stalk. You can see that those are undamaged here, but that whatever energy, whatever heat, whatever damage did that, obviously didn't damage all these little fibrous hairs on the outside of the formation plants. Well, what about the geometry there? Well, the geometry is quite significant. It is based on the flower of life principle, and it obviously has this large vesica and a smaller vesicula, which is evocative of what John Major Jenkins was talking about, which encodes square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 5, sacred geometry. And there were ratios encoded in here, and we're going to hear those in a little bit. Well, here's the formation. Serpent Mound is up on this hill. And later on, after the formation was harvested, the following April, we had an echo of the formation that came up in the field again, where these little flowering purple and green plants came up in the shape of the formation. Well, not too long after that, we received a report of one in Bainbridge, Ohio, again in soybeans. Again, very sophisticated geometry. There were no tracks leading in. This was isolated on an island in the Paint Creek. Half of the formation, this half of the formation, was under standing water when we arrived. It was found approximately the same time as the Locust Grove Formation. The local mayor actually called us to let us know and want us to come out and look at this, but we had actually already been there, which I thought was kind of humorous. This was also in alignment with a Native American mound, the Site Mound Earthworks, of which this is a schematic from the 1800s. There's the mound, and it was in alignment with it. There is the site of the 2000 Bainbridge Formation, which I showed you a picture of one of the circles of on my opening slide. There was a platform mound which existed right here, which doesn't exist any longer, a two-tiered pyramidal platform mound. And there are a whole series of other mounds in this whole valley. Here's the island. There's sort of an oxbow in the river there, and it appeared on that island. And no way to see it. It was completely surrounded by trees. You can see here, there are the trees surrounding it. You could not see it from any roads or anywhere around. This was spotted by a pilot who had actually flown us over the Serpent Mound Formation to take photos of the Serpent Mound Formation about a week before. And so the 2000 formation appeared right here. And so here's the soybeans right there. Now, I did have my GPS unit fry in this formation and in the Serpent Mound Formation. I lost 2 in a row, which gets to be really expensive. And it literally glowed in my hand, and then the electronics just burnt right out. So it's kind of unusual. Well, the geometry here is incredible, and I got to thank Bert Jansen again for these schematics right here. And you can see how evocative it is to the Barbary Castle Formation of '91, and some of the other applications of geometry that has been done on this. Again, based on the flower of life, too. This formation appeared about a month later in soybeans, dry soybeans, ready to harvest soybeans in West Union, Ohio, which is about 25 miles south of the Bainbridge Formation. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. I want to go into 2004. Here are some of the formations early in the year. Hopefully Nancy will let everybody know about these. Nancy Talbot had people that worked on both of these, Peach Orchard, Arkansas, and Spanish Fork, Utah. This one we received a report on in Fairfield, again in Solano County. This obviously has some connection to the electrical power pylons there. This is a drainage creek here. Well, the farmer, when he heard about this, refused to let investigators go in this one and basically harvested the field and did the same thing that the Arkansas farmer did. We could not get him to give us permission to get out there, so we sort of lost any ability on this. These pictures were taken by Theree Davis, who was the one that called me up and gave me this information. It was funny because Steve Moreno in California lives in Fairfield, and she called me up. Well, I live in Michigan, and I had to call Steve up in Fairfield to let him know that it was there. He didn't know about it, so it's kind of unusual how those things work. I did just recently, in the last couple of weeks, receive another report of another eyewitness case from Versailles, Kentucky, that was reported to us that happened over kind of a 3-day period. Some unusual things happened. There was a formation of an unknown configuration consisting of about a dozen circles, egg-shaped areas, and several snake-like pathways that were discovered in a grass field on June 27th. The ranch manager contacted a couple of friends of his who came out. One of the women was suffering from some skin cancer, but she went out there anyways. On the 28th, they returned to the field again, and after about 2 hours of being in the field, they watched as their hands began to glow red, and then they began to get this tingling in their hands, and then they watched these little sparks sort of begin to flow from their hands, and then showers of sparks come out of their hands, and then another crop circle appeared right next to them. And the woman who had skin cancer on her hand reported that the skin cancer actually just fell right off her hand. Now, the next day, 6 additional new circles were reported on the same field, and the landowner decided enough is enough, and he decided to mow it down. And at that point, nobody had even taken a photograph of it, and so we don't have any record of anything more than the eyewitness report at this point. Now, this was investigated. This report from Tilden, Wisconsin was looked at by Chad Lewis and Terry Fisk, 3 circles in oats, and they found unusually that there were these construction lines about 3 inches wide that ran in the field here, but also underneath the formation that seemed to really have no basis in understanding the formation itself, but that were flattened there, and so that was kind of a puzzle to them. Hillsboro, Ohio, was the next report that I received. This was a randomly down patch of corn in someone's garden, 40 by 40 plot. All right. Now this was an incredible case because the corn here you can see is flattened this direction, but all of a sudden shifts and is flattened in this direction. This happens in several places in this little flattened area. We're looking at this section here. This section here was swirled and flattened in 4 different layers of corn. And again, every meter test that we did here came back statistically positive, but that's not all we found there. W.C. Levengood took a look at the plants for us, and here are the growth node cells of the corn, and here are the growth node cells from the flattened plants. They were enlarged by about 40%. So you can see the cellular changes there. He also looked at the soil, and interestingly enough, it's been reported in the past that he's found these little micrometeorite spheres of iron. Well, there's one there, and there's one here and here, but they were encased in another substance. They were embedded within hematite. So we have magnetite embedded in hematite, which is also magnetic, and that's why these showed up in his magnetic soil analysis. But they also had this thin silica shell on the outside. We're just beginning to get our arms around how something can be physically possible to create something like that without a volcanic process being involved. This was found, again, in the top 2 inches of the topsoil. So obviously it's not volcanic material, and it's not, layered in the substrata, so it's kind of unusual. This was reported from West Union during the same month, but this we determined to be mechanically made by people, busted stalks all over, which we never found before in soybeans, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just wanted to make mention of that. And then we received a report in August, late August, from Miamisburg, Ohio. This is in corn. This is a huge formation, 200 plus feet across. Really impressive for corn. We've not seen this sort of sophistication of geometry in a corn formation before. No broken stalks. This is all bent over, swirled down. The formation wasn't visible from any road or building nearby. And this was also in alignment with a mound called the Great Miamisburg Mound, which appeared about a quarter of a mile away. This was in alignment with it. The formation we measured to be LNEAT positive. There have been many anomalous lights photographed and videotaped in this formation by multiple witnesses. When we arrived, we were like the first or second people to actually make it in the formation. There was a reporter that got word from the local sheriff, who was the one that spotted this, and they contacted us, and we went out there to take a look at it. She had walked to the edge of the formation and kind of looked at it and then left. Then we got around and looked at it inside. We got there late in the day, and there's a fire station kind of way off in the distance, and we parked at the fire station, And they were really nice. They knew where it was because they had helped her, and so they walked us out there, and then they helped us in our investigation. We proceeded to be there into the night, and they raised their hook and ladder truck, their big ladder, and put these huge banks of lights up so that we could continue to work well into the night, which was really nice of them. Well, here's the geometry. Exquisite geometry here. This is a comparison that Bert Janssen did of the Serpent Mound Formation overlaid with the Miamisburg Formation. This is a comparison I did showing that all of the major features are comparable between the two formations. Ted Robertson found that there was a repeating fractal pattern encoded within the formation itself, and there are other levels to this as well. Again, D. Gregg did an outstanding job looking at the diatonic ratios, and I want to play this. Ted Robertson has played the notes for us on his harpsichord. He's a master harpsichord maker, and he took the diatonic ratios discovered by D. Gregg, and you're going to hear him right here. Should be going.
I've reassigned the middle C down an octave so that the chord will fit within the range of this keyboard. So I'm reassigning the chord, just transposing it lower so that here's the chord for the Serpent Mound crop circle. We have a C, and middle C, and then the E above it, the G, the D, and then the F. Basically, the chord sounds like this for the Serpent Mound. Notice how it has a triad, and then the Serpent Mound chord. So this is the chord for the Serpent Mound. And for the Miamisburg crop circle, we have a C, an E, a G, an A flat, and a C.
What's important about that A flat is that is the first non-diatonic ratio that's been discovered in a crop circle.
That would give an A. So the combination of all the circles and ratios for Miamisburg would produce this. C, C, E, G, A flat, A, C. The Miamisburg crop circle chord. So here's the Miamisburg crop circle chord with the N harmonic A flat compared to the Serpent Mound chord, which is, okay, so Serpent Mound, Miamisburg. Miamisburg, Serpent Mound.
Everybody got it?
Serpent Mound, Miamisburg.
I think Ted did a really great job on that. Okay. Well, so far this year, we've had 21 reports of formations in the USA so far. We've looked at a few of them. There have been 10 randomly down type formations, 9 circle and pictogram types, 1 known hoax, 1 unconfirmed report. It really has been an amazing year. The collaboration amongst the independent researchers has been outstanding, just phenomenal. And the formations are really among the most sophisticated we've ever seen here in the United States. New developments and discoveries are happening. It's hard to keep it on top of everything. But earlier this year in April, we held a meeting in Ohio, in southern Ohio, near Serpent Mound. And this is the group of people that attended. This is the beginnings of the ICCRA organization, the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association. And you may recognize a few of the faces besides myself, Delcy Knockelman. There's Ted Robertson, Chuck Lietzow. This is, let's see, Mike Miley, people may recognize from UFO Magazine. He was in William Gazecki's film. Just a number of people that really have helped out, and so we're working hard. We've also included people like W.C. Levengood. We've just been working with people like Linda Howe and Nancy Talbot and Colin Andrews, and so we're starting to get our hands around the whole of the phenomenon as best we can, and new things are happening all the time. So I think at this point I'm gonna stop. I do have a few additional slides, and maybe I'll go through those in my in the short workshop about the ICCRA. If people want to come and get a little more information, we'll pass out some information about the ICCRA there. And how much time is left? Enough? That's it? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.